The envelope was small, cream-colored, no return address, slipped under my apartment door sometime between when I left for work and when I came back. I almost stepped on it. I almost didn't open it that night. I wish I had waited. Or maybe I don't. I'm still not sure which. My brother Callum had been in a generous mood at Thanksgiving, which should have been the first sign something was wrong. He refilled my wine glass without being asked. He complimented the sweet potato dish I brought, which he had described 2 years earlier as tasting like a candle somebody gave up on. He laughed at things that weren't particularly funny. The whole evening had the texture of a rehearsal, like everyone at that table had been given a script, and I was the only one reading from the wrong version. My grandmother, Opaline, sat at the head of the table the way she always had. 91 years old, 4 feet 11 inches of absolute precision. She wore a brooch, shaped like a hummingbird even though it was November. She ate slowly and said very little, which for her was not unusual. What was unusual was the way she looked at me. Not with pity exactly. More like someone who's been keeping a secret for a very long time and has finally decided the weight of it belongs to someone else. I didn't understand the look then. I do now. I grew up in a suburb of Charlotte that was exactly what you would picture if someone said the phrase, suburb of Charlotte. Wide streets, brick mailboxes, houses that look like they had been designed by the same architect in the same good mood on the same Tuesday afternoon. My family fit the neighborhood the way furniture fits, a room that was measured before the purchase. My parents, my older brother Callum, my grandmother Opaline, who moved into the in-law suite after my grandfather died when I was 6. Everything in its place. Except me, apparently. I was the quiet one, which in my family translated roughly to invisible. Callum was loud and capable in the way that certain men learn to perform capability before they have actually developed any. He took up space. He had opinions about things I had never thought to have opinions about. The best route to the airport, the correct way to load a dishwasher, which of our cousins had made good choices and which had not. My parents oriented toward him the way you orient toward a sound in the dark, reflexively, without deciding to. I oriented toward my grandmother. Opaline had grown up in rural Virginia and carried that upbringing with her the way some people carry an accent. Not loud, but always there if you listened. She had a word for everything. For the kind of tiredness that comes from pretending everything is fine, she said, bone quiet. For the moment you realize someone is not who you thought they were, she said the picture shifted. She taught me to play gin rummy, and to make biscuits, and to notice when a person's smile didn't reach their eyes. She was the one who saw me. Not just in the warm way people mean when they say that, in the literal sense. She watched. After college, I moved to Raleigh, took a job in nonprofit communications, spent 4 years writing grant reports and learning the particular language of institutional patients. I came home for holidays. I called my grandmother twice a week. I had a small apartment, a cat named Sable, a life I had built carefully from materials that did not include my family's approval, because I had stopped waiting for that somewhere around my mid-20s. My grandfather had left behind a house and property in Virginia, the original family land, about 40 acres outside of a town called Clover, plus the farmhouse that had been in the family for 3 generations. There was also money, not extravagant, but real, the accumulated savings of 2 people who had never spent more than they needed to. My grandmother had managed all of it with the same quietness she brought to everything. Nobody discussed it directly. It sat in the background of family conversations the way certain furniture sits in a room, always there, never mentioned, everyone aware of it. When Opaline turned 90, Callum started visiting more often. I noticed it but did not say anything, because I was practiced at noticing things and not saying anything. He would drive up from Charlotte on weekends. He took her to doctor's appointments. He fixed a gutter and replaced a window screen and was seen by various neighbors I knew, because neighbors always see things, and my grandmother's neighbors were particularly observant. He was building something. I could feel the architecture of it without being able to name the structure. The Thanksgiving envelope arrived 6 weeks after that dinner. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed not handwritten, from an attorney in Charlotte I had never heard of. The letter informed me that I had been removed as a co-beneficiary from my grandmother's will. The change, the letter said, had been executed 4 months prior. The estate would pass entirely to Callum, with a small charitable bequest and a piece of jewelry designated for me. The letter was informational only, no explanation, no contest period mentioned, just the facts, arranged in the clean, bloodless language of legal documents. I stood in my kitchen and read it 3 times. Then I fed Sable, put on my coat, walked down to the corner where there was a bench by a small park, and sat there for 45 minutes while the temperature dropped and a woman with a stroller passed me twice. The feeling was not devastation. It was more like the sensation of pressing on a bruise you forgot you had. Familiar. Old. The specific ache of understanding that your instincts were right all along and you had spent years talking yourself out of trusting them. I called my grandmother the next morning, not to confront, because confronting Opaline directly was like trying to corner fog, but to listen. She asked me about work. She asked about Sable. She said the weather in Charlotte had been mild. I said the same about Raleigh. At the end of the call she said in a tone that was almost too casual, "I need you to come see me before Christmas. Not with the family, just you." I drove down 2 Saturdays later. She made tea, which was her ceremony for serious conversations. She sat across from me at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her mug, and she did not lead up to anything. She said, "Callum told me you were building a case against me. That you'd hired someone to look into my finances, that you were planning to contest the estate." I set my mug down carefully. "He showed me emails," she said. "They had your name on them." I told her I had never hired anyone. I told her I had never hired anyone. I told her I had never contacted a lawyer or discussed her estate with anyone except occasionally my own mother. I told her the only legal document I have received recently was the letter informing me I had already been removed. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know." She had known, she told me, for about 3 weeks. She had a friend, a woman named Dottie, who had worked in legal offices for 30 years before retiring, and Dottie had looked at the emails Callum showed her and said the formatting was wrong. The header fonts were inconsistent. One of them referenced a court that didn't have jurisdiction over anything in North Carolina. Small things. The kind of things you wouldn't notice unless you knew what to look for. Opaline said, "I didn't change my will because I believed him. I changed it because I wanted to see what would happen next." She had, in other words, run an experiment. She had allowed Callum to think he had succeeded. She had watched. She handed me a manila envelope that had been sitting on the counter behind her the whole time I'd been there. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that said only, "Everything is already arranged. Give this to Margaret Sorrell." Margaret Sorrell, it turned out, was an estate attorney in Virginia who had handled my grandfather's original documents and had been updated by my grandmother, in person, at an appointment Callum knew nothing about. 8 days before Thanksgiving. I didn't open the USB drive until I got back to Raleigh. I should have waited until I was less rattled, but I didn't. So I sat on my kitchen floor at 11 at night with my laptop balanced on a box I hadn't unpacked from my last move, and I opened it. It contained folders. Each one dated, each one labeled. The first folder held a series of text messages, exported and printed to PDF, between Callum and someone he'd saved in his contacts simply as DF. They spanned 14 months. The messages discussed the property in Clover extensively. They discussed the grandmother situation. There were specific references to the will, to what DF called the repositioning, and at one point to finding someone who could produce documents that looked legitimate enough to change an old woman's mind. The second folder held bank statements for an account I hadn't known existed. The account was in my grandmother's name, but the authorized signer was Callum. Over the previous 2 years, transfers totaling $63,000 had moved out of it in increments designed, a financial examiner would later tell me, to stay below reporting thresholds. The money went into an LLC registered in South Carolina with an address that was a UPS store in Greenville. The third folder was a video. My grandmother had recorded herself on what appeared to be a tablet propped against a stack of books. She was sitting in the same chair I'd seen her in 1,000 times. She was wearing the hummingbird brooch. She spoke for 11 minutes, clearly and without notes, describing everything she had discovered, when she had discovered it, and what she wanted done. She named Callum directly. She named the attorney he had been working with, a man in Charlotte with a suspended license who apparently had not mentioned that detail. She stated that she was of sound mind, that she had been advised by Margaret Sorrell, and that the will on file with Sorrell's office represented her true and current wishes. At the end of the video, she paused and looked directly at the camera. She said, "I know this is a hard thing to carry. I'm sorry I couldn't give it to you differently. But I needed you not to know, because if you had known, you would have tried to protect me, and I didn't need protecting. I needed witnesses." I watched it twice, then I sat with it in the way you sit with things that are both terrible and necessary at the same time. I called Margaret Sorrell on Monday morning. She was expecting me. She said, in the measured tone of someone who has spent decades in rooms where family money changes hands, "Your grandmother was one of the more prepared clients I've worked with in 30 years. She had done most of my job before she walked in the door. The process after that was not fast. These things never are. There were filings and responses and a period of about 6 weeks where Callum's attorney, not the suspended one, a new one he retained quickly once the situation became clear, made noises about challenging the competency of the revised will. They stopped making those noises when Margaret produced the video and the notarized statement from my grandmother's primary care physician dated the same week as the recording, confirming that she was fully competent and had discussed her estate plans in detail at a recent appointment. The $63,000 became a matter for a separate proceeding. My parents were largely silent through all of it. My mother called me once to say she hoped I wasn't enjoying this, and I told her honestly that I wasn't. Enjoying was the wrong word entirely. I was surviving it. There is a difference. Callum sent me one message, 3 weeks after the estate was formally settled. It said, "You always were her favorite," that was all. No apology. No acknowledgement of the false documents, the missing money, the 14 months of planning that had gone into trying to cut me out of something that was never really about the money at all. Not for me. It was about being seen as worth something. Being included. Being considered real enough to matter in the accounting of a life? I didn't respond. The property in Clover came to me along with the primary estate. I drove out to see it in early spring, before the trees had fully come back. 40 acres outside a small town that barely showed up on maps. A farmhouse with a porch that sagged on the left side, a barn that had not been used in 20 years, a creek at the back edge of the property that my grandmother had mentioned exactly once, telling me that she and my grandfather had sat by it on their first summer there and decided they would stay. I stood on that porch for a long time. The sagging side felt honest to me in a way that I found I needed. I am not living there yet. I still have my apartment in Raleigh, my job, Sable, my routines. But I have been out to the property 4 times since then, and each time something in my chest settles in a way it does not settle anywhere else. I am having the porch fixed. I planted some things along the south side of the farmhouse. I am learning what the land needs before I decide what I need from it. My grandmother died in February, about 7 months after all of this. She died in her own bed in Charlotte, which was what she had always said she wanted. I was there. Callum was not, because by then, the estrangement had become official in the way that facts become official. Not with an announcement, but with an absence that goes on long enough to become permanent. She held my hand at the end and didn't say anything remarkable. She didn't need to. She had already said it in an 11-minute video in which she looked at the camera and told me exactly what she had done and why. I kept the hummingbird brooch. I am not a brooch person in general, but I keep it in a small dish on my dresser. Sometimes I pick it up and hold it for a minute. It is heavier than you would expect for something so small. There's a question I have been sitting with since all of this happened. Not who my grandmother was. I knew who she was, but why she waited. Why she let it go so far before she acted. I think I understand it now in a way I couldn't have in the middle of it. She was not a woman who acted on suspicion. She needed the thing to be real, provable, undeniable, before she would move against someone she had loved for 60 years. That is not weakness. That is a particular kind of precision that costs something. She paid the cost, and then she made sure I wouldn't have to. I think about what she said in the video. I needed witnesses. I have turned that sentence over in my mind more times than I can count. She wasn't talking about legal witnesses, though those mattered too. She meant something else. She meant she needed someone who would understand completely what was taken, what was preserved, what it had cost to protect quietly over years, and would carry that understanding forward. That's what she gave me. Not the property, not the money, the understanding. Some people guard you with noise. They make it known that you are theirs and that anyone who comes for you will have to come through them first. My grandmother did not do any of that. She guarded the way she did everything, patiently, invisibly, with the full attention of someone who trusted time and hated shortcuts. I turned 31 last month. I spent the day out at the property in Clover. I sat by the creek she had told me about and watched the water for a while, which was something I had never done before and found, to my surprise, that I was good at. I don't know what the right question is to end on. I don't have a tidy one. What I have is this. Someone believed I was worth protecting before I believed it myself, and she was careful enough and patient enough and wise enough to make that protection stick. Not every family gives you that. Not every person in your life sees you clearly and acts on what they see. If you've ever had someone like that, someone quiet, someone who watched, someone whose love only became visible after the fact, then you already know what I mean. If you haven't, I hope you find one. I used to think patience was a passive thing, something you did while waiting for other people to act. Opaline taught me it was the opposite. Patience, the real kind, is a form of attention so steady and so disciplined that most people mistake it for indifference. She watched Callum for months. She watched him fix gutters and smile at neighbors and position himself as the devoted grandchild. She let him think he was winning. And the whole time, she was building something he couldn't see. That is not luck, that is character accumulated over 91 years. What I keep coming back to is this. Callum was not stupid. He was strategic, organized, patient in his own way. He had a plan that spanned over a year, involved forged documents, a lawyer operating without a valid license, and financial transfers carefully designed to avoid detection. He put real effort into it, and it still collapsed completely, not because of chance, but because of choices, his own and hers. Every decision he made was built on the assumption that the people around him were not paying attention. That assumption was the entire foundation of what he built, and it was wrong. There's something clarifying about watching that kind of structure fall. Not satisfying in a simple way, not something I would describe as enjoyable, but clarifying, because it confirmed something I had suspected for a long time without being able to prove, that the things people do in secret are rarely as invisible as they believe. Someone is almost always watching. The question is only whether that person will act, and when, and how. I think about the version of this where Opaline had not been paying attention, where she had simply taken Callum's word for what the email said, where Margaret Sorrell had never existed, or where my grandmother had been the kind of person who trusts the loudest voice in the room. In that version, I lose everything, not just the property and the estate, but the proof that I had ever been seen clearly by anyone in my family. That loss would have been harder to carry than any financial one. What protected me was not luck or position or any advantage I had built for myself. It was someone else's integrity operating quietly over a long period of time. That is a humbling thing to sit with. It makes me want to be more like her, not in strategy, not in the specific mechanics of what she did, but in the underlying discipline. The willingness to watch carefully, to wait for the thing to be real before you move, to trust your own observations even when the people around you are telling a different story. The money will be used to fix a porch and plant things along the south side of a farmhouse and maybe eventually to live differently than I have been living. The property in Clover is real and it is mine and I am learning what it needs. But the thing Opaline actually left me is harder to name and more useful than any of that. It is the understanding that integrity is not passive. It is not simply refusing to do wrong. It is actively, patiently, methodically doing right even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching. Because the record you build in those moments is the only one that holds when everything else is contested. Callum bet everything on the idea that I was easy to dismiss. Opaline bet everything on the idea that I was worth protecting. One of them knew me. The other one only thought they did.